I came for a peaceful weekend at my inherited cabin and found my brother-in-law's moving truck in the driveway. When I confronted him, he smirked and said, "Jacob gave us permission to move in and your objections are irrelevant since you're not the only owner." I called the police. The absolute audacity of his words hit me like a physical blow. Standing there in my grandfather's driveway watching strangers unload furniture into the cabin that represented 4 decades of my family's history, I felt a surge of rage so intense it actually steadied my voice. Finn's casual dismissal of my ownership rights wasn't just trespassing. It was a calculated psychological attack designed to make me question my own authority over property I'd inherited fair and square. But beneath the anger, my analytical mind was already working. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. The moving truck, the coordinated timing when they knew I'd be arriving for my weekend retreat, the prepared excuse about Jacob's supposed permission. This was a planned invasion. They'd gambled everything on the assumption that once they were physically present with all their belongings and a crying child, I'd cave to avoid confrontation. They'd studied my personality, identified what they thought was weakness, and crafted this entire scenario to exploit it. What they didn't understand was that my apparent conflict avoidance wasn't weakness at all. It was strategic patience. For months, I'd been documenting every manipulation attempt, every boundary violation, every escalating demand. My legal background had taught me that emotional reactions destroy cases, while methodical evidence gathering wins them. They thought they were dealing with a pushover who'd inherited a cabin. They were actually facing a corporate litigation specialist who'd spent 8 years building airtight cases against sophisticated opponents. As I watched Amber emerge from my cabin carrying little Lily, using the child's confusion as emotional leverage, I realized this moment would define everything. Either I would establish clear consequences for their criminal behavior, or I would spend the rest of my life fighting increasingly bold invasions of my boundaries. The choice was remarkably simple when viewed through that lens. My background as a senior associate at one of the state's most prestigious corporate law firms had given me advantages they couldn't even comprehend. I'd spent the last 8 years specializing in complex property disputes, particularly cases involving family members who attempted to claim ownership rights they didn't legally possess. My success rate stood at 94% with an average settlement value of $2 million per case. I'd faced opponents far more sophisticated than Finn and Amber, and I'd developed a reputation for methodical preparation that made opposing counsel recommend settlements rather than face me in court. The cabin itself represented far more than a weekend retreat. When my grandfather passed 3 years ago, he left me a property worth $340,000, sitting on 2 acres of pristine lakefront that had appreciated 23% annually for the past decade. The inheritance was structured specifically to prevent any claims from other family members, with my grandfather's will explicitly stating that the property was mine alone, in recognition of the summers I'd spent helping him maintain and improve it. Jacob had no legal claim whatsoever, despite what Finn was suggesting to justify his invasion. More importantly, I had liquid assets totaling $127,000 in savings, plus a stock portfolio worth another $89,000. My annual salary of $98,000 provided complete financial independence, and my position at the firm gave me access to legal resources that would cost most people hundreds of thousands of dollars. I could afford to fight this battle on every front simultaneously, criminal, civil, and professional, without compromising my own financial security. My professional network included prosecutors who'd worked with me on white-collar crime cases, private investigators I'd hired for complex litigation, and real estate specialists who understood property law better than most judges. These weren't just contacts. They were collaborators who'd seen my work and trusted my judgment. When I called them with evidence of criminal trespassing and attempted theft of property rights, they would respond immediately because they knew I didn't waste their time with frivolous complaints. The strategic advantage I possessed was information. For 2 months, I'd been documenting every escalation, every manipulation attempt, every conversation where Jacob's family revealed their true intentions. I had recordings of Carol explicitly stating that they expected to essentially take over the cabin permanently. I had text messages where Dennis suggested that my grandfather's wishes were irrelevant compared to their current needs. Most damaging of all, I had documentation of their systematic campaign to wear down Jacob's resistance through coordinated family pressure. What made this situation different from typical family disputes was the clear criminal element. This wasn't a disagreement about holiday plans or wedding invitations. This was breaking and entering, trespassing, and attempted theft of services. The fact that they were related to my husband was legally irrelevant once they'd committed crimes on my property. My litigation experience had taught me that family relationships often made people think they were above the law. But judges and prosecutors had zero tolerance for criminals who used family connections to justify their behavior. After securing that devastating recording of Finn's admission that Jacob hadn't actually given permission, my next step was implementing the same systematic approach that had made me successful in complex corporate litigation. I immediately contacted Patricia Vance, the senior prosecutor I'd worked with on 3 major fraud cases. Patricia specialized in property crimes and had a conviction rate of 97% when presented with clear evidence chains. Based on what you're describing, this is textbook criminal trespassing with intent to permanently deprive you of your property rights, Patricia told me during our emergency consultation. The fact that they coordinated this invasion suggests conspiracy charges as well. If you have the documentation you've mentioned, this case will be stronger than most of the ones I prosecute. Patricia's immediate assessment confirmed my strategic thinking. She explained that family property disputes often involved gray areas around permission and access rights. But this situation was clearly criminal because they'd explicitly been denied permission and had proceeded anyway. The moving truck full of belongings demonstrated intent to permanently occupy my property, which elevated the charges from simple trespassing to attempted theft of real property. Her next question was crucial. How comprehensive is your evidence documentation? When I explained my systematic recording and photographing of every interaction for the past 2 months, her response was immediate. Most people bring me family property cases with nothing but he said, she said testimony. You're bringing me a prosecution-ready case file. This is exactly how successful criminal cases are built. I also consulted with Marcus Webb, a private investigator who'd helped me uncover hidden assets in complex corporate cases. Marcus specialized in surveillance and background investigations, and his military intelligence background made him particularly effective at documenting criminal behavior without alerting suspects. His assessment was equally encouraging. Family members who think they can get away with property theft are usually sloppy about covering their tracks, Marcus explained. They assume family relationships will protect them from consequences, so they don't take the precautions that actual criminals use. This makes them easier to prosecute than professional property thieves. Marcus immediately offered to conduct surveillance of Finn and Amber to document any additional criminal activity. He'd already identified their pattern of escalating demands and predicted they would attempt to establish permanent residence, if not stopped, immediately. His professional opinion was that calling law enforcement was not only appropriate, but necessary to prevent more serious crimes. My consultation with Robert Dale, a real estate attorney who specialized in property rights disputes, provided the final piece of my strategic framework. Robert had successfully defended property owners in over 200 cases involving family members who attempted to claim ownership rights they didn't possess. The beauty of property law is that ownership is clearly documented and legally protected, Robert explained. Unlike other family disputes that involve subjective interpretations, property rights are absolute. You either own it or you don't. They either have permission or they don't. There's no middle ground for manipulative family dynamics. Robert's analysis confirmed that Jacob's lack of ownership rights meant his supposed permission was legally meaningless even if he had actually given it. The cabin was my separate property, inherited independently of my marriage, and Jacob had no legal authority to grant access to anyone. This meant Finn's justification was not only false, but irrelevant, even if it had been true. The documentation phase of my strategy involved creating an evidence file that would satisfy prosecutors, civil attorneys, and judges simultaneously. Using techniques I'd developed for complex corporate cases, I organized everything into chronological sections with supporting exhibits and legal analysis. The file included 67 photographs of the trespassing incident, 23 audio recordings of family conversations revealing their coordination, and 45 text messages documenting their escalating demands over 2 months. Most crucially, I had Jacob's phone conversation with the sheriff's deputy clearly stating that he'd never given permission for anyone to move into the cabin and confirming that they were trespassing. This recording eliminated any possible defense based on family confusion or miscommunication. In Jacob's own words, captured on official law enforcement recording equipment, their presence was criminal. The strategic timing of my law enforcement contact was carefully calculated. Rather than calling 911 in apparent panic, I called the non-emergency number and calmly explained that I had trespassers who were refusing to leave my property and that I had documentation of their criminal behavior. This approach established me as a rational property owner, seeking appropriate legal remedies rather than someone having a family dispute. When Deputy Harrison arrived, I immediately provided him with my documentation file, my property deed, and Jacob's contact information for verification. My professional presentation contrasted sharply with Finn and Amber's emotional desperation and obvious lies about having permission. The deputy's report would reflect that I was prepared, organized, and credible, while they were caught in multiple lies and attempting to manipulate law enforcement. The evidence gathering continued even during the confrontation. Using my phone's recording app, I captured Finn's admission that they'd already given notice on their apartment and had no backup housing plan. This recording proved premeditation and demonstrated that their property invasion was permanent rather than temporary. It also showed their willingness to make their child homeless rather than find legitimate housing solutions. Most damaging was Amber's recorded statement that they'd been counting on my eventual agreement despite my explicit refusal. This admission proved they'd intentionally ignored my clearly stated boundaries and had gambled their family's housing security on their ability to manipulate me through emotional pressure. No reasonable person would terminate their lease and move their belongings based on anything less than explicit written permission. The consequences began immediately and escalated systematically, as my strategic framework predicted. Within 24 hours, Finn and Amber were formally charged with criminal trespassing, attempted theft of property rights, and conspiracy to commit property crimes. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 18 months in jail and $15,000 in fines, plus mandatory restitution for any damages to my property. Their immediate response was to blame me for destroying the family and making children homeless, but their narrative fell apart when prosecutors revealed the evidence of premeditation. The recorded conversations showing months of coordinated family pressure made it impossible to claim this was a misunderstanding or spontaneous decision. They'd planned this invasion carefully and had gambled that I wouldn't have the resolve to enforce legal consequences. Carol and Dennis faced their own consequences when prosecutors discovered their role in coordinating the pressure campaign. Their recorded statements about my grandfather's supposed intentions and their suggestions that property ownership was less important than family needs constituted conspiracy to commit property crimes. While they weren't charged criminally, they received formal warnings about future attempts to interfere with my property rights. The extended family members who'd supported Finn and Amber's demands suddenly distanced themselves when they realized criminal charges were involved. Several of Jacob's aunts and uncles who'd previously called him to criticize our decision now apologized and claimed they'd never understood the full situation. Their reversal was complete and immediate once they faced potential association with property crimes. Jacob's transformation was the most significant consequence of my strategic response. The shock of seeing his brother arrested for crimes committed against his wife finally broke through months of family manipulation. He realized that his attempts to find middle ground had enabled criminal behavior, and that his family's supposed love was contingent on his willingness to sacrifice his marriage for their convenience. Within a week, Jacob had publicly supported my decision to press charges and had cut contact with family members who continued to defend Finn's criminal behavior. He installed security cameras at our apartment and changed his phone number to stop the harassment calls. Most importantly, he began paying for family therapy to address the manipulation and guilt tactics that had nearly destroyed our marriage. The professional consequences for my opposition were swift and comprehensive. Finn's arrest resulted in immediate termination from his part-time construction job, as his employer couldn't risk liability from employee criminal activity. Amber lost her grocery store position when she failed to show up for several shifts while dealing with court proceedings. Their combined loss of income eliminated any possibility of finding legitimate housing. The legal costs quickly overwhelmed their limited resources. Public defender services were adequate for basic criminal defense, but they needed civil attorneys to attempt challenging my property rights. The retainer fees alone exceeded their annual income, and no attorney was willing to take their case on contingency because the evidence against them was overwhelming. Carol and Dennis discovered that their coordination of the pressure campaign had created potential liability for them as well. When they consulted attorneys about helping Finn fight the charges, they were warned that their documented statements could result in their own prosecution if they continued interfering. This warning effectively ended their public support for Finn's position. Finn ultimately pled guilty to criminal trespassing and agreed to pay $8,400 in restitution for security system installation, legal fees, and property damage. He received 12 months probation with conditions that included no contact with me and no approach within 500 feet of the cabin. Violation of these conditions would trigger immediate jail time and additional charges. Amber moved back to her parents' home in another state with Lily, effectively ending her relationship with both Finn and Jacob's family. The stress of homelessness, criminal charges, and financial ruin had destroyed their engagement within 2 weeks of the cabin incident. Carol and Dennis entered family therapy under court recommendation after their role in the conspiracy was documented. They were required to pay for Jacob's therapy sessions as restitution for their manipulation campaign. Their relationship with Jacob remained severed until they could demonstrate acceptance of appropriate boundaries and acknowledgement of their destructive behavior. Jacob emerged from the experience as a stronger, more independent person who'd learned to recognize manipulation tactics and enforce healthy boundaries. Our marriage recovered and strengthened as he developed skills for managing family pressure without sacrificing our relationship. I expanded the cabin's security system and formally established it as a retreat center for other professionals dealing with family property disputes. The legal precedent from Finn's prosecution became a model case study used by property attorneys and law enforcement agencies for training on family-based property crimes. The cabin remained our peaceful sanctuary, protected by legal precedent and comprehensive security measures that prevented any future invasion attempts.